my psycho ex poisoned every pet I rescued, until I rescued a Rottweiler named Max who had been trained by the police before being retired. I came home from the animal shelter yesterday to find Jake standing in my backyard, holding a raw steak in one hand and a small glass vial in the other. Max was on the other side of the fence, every muscle tensed, a low warning growl rumbling from his throat that made the hair on my arms stand up. Jake didn't see me yet. He was too focused on trying to coax Max closer with that meat, shaking the vial like it was seasoning, his face twisted in this sick concentration that made my stomach turn. When Max lunged forward and slammed against the fence with a bark that shook the wooden posts, Jake stumbled backward and dropped both items. That's when he finally noticed me standing there with my phone out, already recording everything. The shock on his face lasted maybe 3 seconds before it morphed into that familiar, manipulative smile, the one I'd fallen for 2 years ago when we first met at the coffee shop downtown. He raised his hands like this was all some hilarious misunderstanding, started babbling about how he was just checking on me, wanted to make sure my new dog was friendly, brought him a treat because he's such a nice guy. But his eyes kept darting to that vial on the ground, the same type of container I'd seen in the veterinary report for Whiskers, and Bella, and Charlie, and every single one of the 7 other animals I'd rescued and lost over the past 18 months since our breakup. I'm a veterinary technician at Riverside Animal Hospital, have been for 6 years now. I specialize in rehabilitating abused and abandoned animals, the ones that come in half-starved with matted fur and terrified eyes that break your heart. Jake knew this about me when we dated. He'd even pretended to support it, showing up at the shelter with donations, helping me build that outdoor cat enclosure in my backyard, acting like he cared about these creatures as much as I did. But 3 months after I caught him in bed with my supposed best friend Monica and kicked him out, my first rescue after the breakup started showing symptoms. Whiskers, a beautiful orange tabby who'd survived being dumped on the highway, began vomiting blood. The emergency vet couldn't save him. Cardiac arrest from acute poisoning, they said, but couldn't identify the exact toxin. I was devastated. Then it happened again, and again. Each time I'd bring home a new rescue, shower them with love and proper care, watch them start to trust again, and within 2 weeks they'd be dead. The police said there wasn't enough evidence to investigate. My friends thought I was paranoid when I mentioned Jake. Even my own mother suggested maybe I was just unlucky, that perhaps I wasn't as good at this rescue work as I thought. But I knew. I knew it in my bones every time I found another lifeless body. Every time I had to make that horrible call to the shelter explaining another failed adoption. Jake was systematically destroying the one thing that gave my life meaning, and he was getting away with it. Until Max. I hadn't planned to adopt him. The shelter director, Mrs. Patterson, had called me specifically about this case. Retired police K9, 8 years old, owner died suddenly, and the family couldn't handle him. Fully trained in protection, detection, and apprehension. I almost said no, told her I was taking a break from fostering after losing so many, but something in her voice made me go see him anyway. Max sat in that kennel like a statue, dark eyes assessing every person who walked past, completely uninterested in the other dogs barking around him. When I approached, he didn't jump or whine like the others. He just watched me with this intense intelligence that felt almost human. I knelt down and he came to the bars, pressed his massive head against my hand, and I swear I felt this connection, like he understood everything I'd been through. Mrs. Patterson mentioned that his handler had trained him specifically to detect narcotics and other dangerous substances. She said it almost casually, but I heard it like a gunshot. A dog trained to detect poison. I signed the adoption papers that same day. Jake had been watching my house. That much was obvious now. He must have seen me bring Max home, watched me introducing him to the backyard, observed our routine for the past 3 days waiting for his opportunity. What he didn't know was that I'd also installed 6 new security cameras with audio after losing Charlie, hidden them in the trees and under the eaves where you'd never spot them unless you knew exactly where to look. Everything was being recorded. His face, his actions, his intent. And Max, beautiful, brilliant Max, had done exactly what his training demanded when he detected that poison Jake was trying to feed him. He'd alerted, refused the food, and protected his new territory. The evidence I'd needed for 18 months of grief and helplessness was finally in my hands, captured in perfect high-definition video with timestamps and audio. Jake's eyes kept sliding from my phone to the fence where Max stood rigid, still growling that low, continuous warning that said one wrong move, and those jaws would do more than bark. What Jake doesn't know yet is that I didn't just adopt a dog. I adopted a weapon. One that's trained to detect, to protect, and to take down threats when commanded. One that's legally registered as a service animal with full certification from the police department. One whose testimony, through his trained responses and reactions, holds up in court better than most human witnesses. And in about 45 seconds, when the police arrive in response to the silent alarm I triggered the moment I saw him in my yard, he's going to discover that poisoning rescue animals was just the beginning of his problems. Because Max isn't like Whiskers, or Bella, or Charlie, or any of the other innocent creatures Jake murdered. Max is a 90-pound Rottweiler who's been trained to bring down armed suspects and protect his handler at all costs. And as I watch Jake's smile falter, see him realize he's been caught on camera attempting to poison another animal, see him glance toward the gate like he's thinking about running, I let myself smile for the first time in 18 months. Run, Jake. Please run. Max could use the exercise, and I could use the satisfaction of watching him learn what it feels like to be the helpless one. The police cruiser pulled up within 90 seconds, Officer Davis and Officer Chen stepping out with that practiced casualness that comes from years of responding to calls. Jake's whole demeanor shifted instantly, shoulders relaxing, hands going into his pockets like he was just a casual visitor. He started walking toward them with this easy smile, already opening his mouth to spin whatever story he'd concocted. But Officer Davis held up one hand, eyes locked on the glass vial still lying in the grass near the fence. Max had moved to sit directly beside me now, his body pressed against my leg in that protective stance his handler must have trained into him, still watching Jake with unwavering attention. I handed Officer Davis my phone before Jake could say a word, the video already cued to the moment Jake entered my yard. We all watched in silence as Jake's recorded voice drifted from the speaker, muttering to himself about how this would be the last one, how after this I'd finally stop rescuing these stupid animals, and maybe realize what I'd lost. His recorded hand shook that vial over the raw meat with practiced efficiency, like he'd done it many times before. Officer Chen's jaw tightened as he watched, and when he looked up at Jake, any pretense of casual friendliness had evaporated completely. Jake's face had gone gray, his eyes darting between the officers and my phone like he could somehow make the evidence disappear if he just thought hard enough. Officer Davis bent down to examine the vial without touching it, then called for Detective Morrison from the department. While we waited, Jake finally found his voice, stammering something about how this was all a misunderstanding, how he was actually trying to help, how that vial was just vitamins because he'd heard I was having trouble with my animal's health. The lies tumbled out so fast they tripped over each other, each one more desperate than the last. Officer Chen asked him to please remain silent until the detective arrived, then turned to me and asked about the other animals I'd mentioned in my initial report. I pulled up the folder on my phone, the one I'd been building for months, filled with vet reports, death certificates, timeline logs, and photos of each animal I'd lost. Whiskers with his bright green eyes, Bella's gray-spotted fur, Charlie's ridiculous underbite that made him look like he was always smiling. 9 animals total, 9 separate incidents, all following the same pattern. Detective Morrison arrived with a crime scene technician who immediately bagged the vial and the raw meat as evidence. Max never moved from my side, but I could feel the tension in his body, the way he tracked Jake's every movement with those dark, intelligent eyes. The detective listened to my entire story standing in the middle of my backyard, taking notes in a small leather notebook, while the technician photographed everything. When I mentioned that I'd started documenting Jake's car parked down the street on different occasions, always within view of my house, the detective's expression hardened. Jake tried to interrupt twice, but Officer Davis cut him off both times, reminding him of his right to remain silent. The technician called Detective Morrison over to examine something near the back fence, where Jake had apparently tried this before. There were 3 other raw meat chunks in various stages of decay, hidden in the tall grass just outside Max's reach. My stomach turned. He'd been attempting this for days, probably since the moment I brought Max home, waiting for the right opportunity when the dog would be hungry enough or distracted enough to take the bait. If Max had been any other dog, any of the sweet, trusting rescues I usually brought home, I'd be planning another funeral right now. Detective Morrison photographed each piece of meat, marking their locations with small yellow evidence markers that made my backyard look like a crime scene from those TV shows. Because that's exactly what it was. A crime scene. Multiple attempted murders, if you counted each animal separately. Jake's lawyer arrived before they took him away, some slick guy in an expensive suit who immediately started talking about circumstantial evidence and harassment claims. But his confidence visibly cracked when Detective Morrison showed him the video, then the bagged evidence, then the documentation of all 9 previous animal deaths that followed the exact same pattern. The lawyer's mouth opened and closed a few times before he finally suggested they continue this conversation downtown. As Officer Chen walked Jake toward the police car, Jake turned back to look at me with such pure hatred that I actually took a step backward. Max's growl deepened into something that raised every hair on my body, and Jake quickly looked away, all that false bravado crumbling as he realized that for once he couldn't charm or manipulate or threaten his way out of consequences. My neighbor Sarah came rushing over as they loaded Jake into the cruiser, demanding to know what happened. She'd lived next door for 3 years, but we'd never been particularly close. Now she grabbed my arm and said she'd seen Jake in my yard multiple times over the past months, always when I wasn't home, always going straight to the back where the animals were kept. She said she'd thought it was weird, but figured maybe we were still together or working things out. Her testimony would be crucial, Detective Morrison said, writing down her contact information. Then my other neighbor Tom appeared, the retired veteran who lived on the other side, admitting he'd also seen Jake lurking around, but hadn't wanted to get involved in what he assumed was relationship drama. Suddenly, everyone had noticed Jake's stalking behavior, but nobody had said anything until now, when there was finally undeniable proof of his actions. Detective Morrison asked me to come to the station the next day to give a formal statement and bring all my documentation. As she handed me her card, she mentioned that the substance in the vial appeared to be the same industrial rodenticide that had been used in several other suspicious animal deaths around the county over the past 2 years. My heart stopped. Other animals. Other victims. Jake hadn't just been targeting my rescues. He'd been doing this to other people too, probably anyone who'd crossed him or rejected him or simply had something he wanted to destroy. The detective saw my expression and nodded grimly, saying they'd been trying to build a case for months but could never connect the incidents until now. Until Max. Until my security cameras. Until Jake's arrogance made him careless enough to get caught red-handed. That night, after everyone left and the evidence was collected, and Jake was sitting in a cell downtown, I sat on my back porch with Max's massive head resting on my lap. His tail thumped once against the deck when I scratched behind his ears, and I realized I was crying for the first time since Whiskers died. Not sad tears this time, but something else. Relief, maybe. Vindication. The crushing weight of being called paranoid and crazy and overly dramatic for 18 months had finally lifted. I'd been right all along. Every instinct, every suspicion, every sleepless night worrying that Jake would strike again had been completely justified. And now there was proof, evidence, witnesses. Jake couldn't gaslight his way out of this one. As Max settled in closer, his warm weight grounding me to this moment, I pulled out my phone and scrolled through the photos of all the animals I'd lost. Sweet Whiskers, gentle Bella, goofy Charlie. I promised them, right there under the stars, that Jake would pay for what he did, that their deaths wouldn't be meaningless, that justice was finally coming. The preliminary hearing happened 2 weeks later in a courthouse that smelled like old wood and industrial cleaner. I sat in the front row with Max lying at my feet, his service vest making him legally allowed in the courtroom. Jake's expensive lawyer had tried to argue against it, claiming the dog's presence was prejudicial and intimidating to his client. The judge, a sharp-eyed woman named Henderson who looked like she'd heard every ridiculous argument known to man, asked if Jake felt threatened by a service animal performing its legally protected duties. When Jake's lawyer fumbled through some nonsense about optics, Judge Henderson shut him down so fast I almost smiled. Max stayed, and Jake spent the entire hearing unable to look in our direction without his hands shaking. The prosecution laid out their case methodically. 9 dead animals, all rescued by me, all dying within 2 weeks of adoption, all showing signs of the same industrial rodenticide now found in Jake's possession. They presented my security footage, the neighbors' testimonies, and phone records showing Jake had been tracking my movements through a GPS device he'd hidden in my car during our relationship. I hadn't known about that last part. The rage that surged through me when they mentioned it must have been visible because Max pressed his head against my knee. That grounding pressure that said he was there. I was safe. Everything would be okay. Jake's lawyer tried arguing that the GPS tracking was legal between romantic partners, which earned him such a withering look from Judge Henderson that he actually apologized and moved on. Then came the evidence from the other cases Detective Morrison had mentioned. 7 additional animal deaths across 3 counties, all following similar patterns, all connected to people who'd had negative interactions with Jake. A woman who'd rejected him at a bar found her cat dead the next week. A coworker who'd reported him for harassment lost his elderly dog days later. An ex-girlfriend before me had lost 3 rabbits in a single month. The prosecutor presented veterinary records, witness statements, and security footage from various locations showing Jake near the victims' homes. The pattern was undeniable, obsessive, methodical. This wasn't about me personally. This was about control and revenge and punishing anyone who dared to reject or challenge Jake in any way. Animals were just the easiest targets because they couldn't fight back, and their deaths rarely triggered serious police investigations. During the lunch recess, Monica appeared in the courthouse hallway. I hadn't seen her since the day I'd caught them together, and seeing her now brought back that stomach-churning moment of betrayal. But she looked terrible, thin and hollow-eyed, nothing like the confident woman who'd smiled at me while sitting in my bed wearing my robe. She approached hesitantly, keeping her distance from Max, and asked if we could talk. Every instinct screamed to tell her to get lost, but something in her expression made me pause. We found an empty conference room and she spilled everything. Jake had discarded her within a month, just like I'd predicted, but not before isolating her from all her other friends and manipulating her into believing she was worthless without him. When she'd finally tried to leave, her new puppy died mysteriously. She hadn't connected it to Jake until she saw the news coverage of his arrest. Now she wanted to testify, wanted to add her dog's death to the evidence pile, wanted to make sure Jake could never do this to anyone else ever again. The afternoon session brought expert testimony from a forensic veterinarian who specialized in animal poisoning cases. She explained in clinical detail exactly how the rodenticide worked, how it caused internal bleeding and organ failure, how the animals would have suffered before finally dying. Jake's face went pale as she described each symptom, each stage of the poisoning process. His lawyer objected multiple times, claiming the testimony was too graphic and inflammatory, but Judge Henderson overruled every objection. The families of the victims deserved to understand exactly what had been done to their beloved companions, she said. The courtroom fell silent except for the veterinarian's steady voice cataloging the cruelty. Then it was my turn to testify. The prosecutor walked me through each animal, asking me to describe their personalities, their quirks, what had made each one special. Whiskers loved to sleep in the bathroom sink. Bella would bring me her favorite toy every morning at exactly 6. Charlie had been terrified of everything when I first brought him home, but after 3 days he'd finally let me pet him, and the joy in his eyes had made me cry. As I talked about them, really talked about them as individuals rather than just victims, I saw several jury members wiping their eyes. Jake's lawyer tried to object, claiming my testimony was emotional manipulation, but Judge Henderson shut him down again. These were the victims, she said. Their lives mattered. Their suffering mattered. Jake's lawyer made a mistake during cross-examination. He asked me if I'd ever considered that perhaps my rescue work was attracting these tragedies, that maybe I wasn't qualified to care for such damaged animals, that perhaps their deaths were simply unfortunate coincidences rather than deliberate acts. I stared at him for a long moment, watching him preen with confidence over what he clearly thought was a brilliant line of questioning. Then I pulled out my veterinary technician license, my 6 years of performance reviews, my certifications in animal rehabilitation and trauma care. I explained in detail my qualifications, my success rate with other rescues before Jake entered my life, the dozens of animals I'd successfully rehabilitated and placed in loving homes. The lawyer's confidence crumbled as I methodically destroyed his implication that I was somehow responsible for these deaths. When I finished, even he looked uncomfortable with the hole he'd dug. The prosecutor's rebuttal was devastating. They brought in Mrs. Patterson from the shelter, who testified about my reputation in the rescue community, about how my success rate had been nearly perfect until Jake and I broke up. They presented records showing that in the 4 years before Jake, I'd fostered over 60 animals with only 2 deaths, both from pre-existing conditions documented by veterinarians before I'd even taken custody. In the 18 months after Jake, 9 animals died under mysterious circumstances. The statistical improbability was damning. Jake's lawyer had no response, just sat there shuffling papers and avoiding eye contact with the jury. That evening, Detective Morrison called me at home. The toxicology results had come back on the vial Jake had been carrying. Industrial rodenticide, just as suspected, but with an interesting addition. He'd mixed in a flavoring agent that made it virtually undetectable in raw meat, something he'd clearly researched and prepared specifically for poisoning animals. It demonstrated premeditation, planning, intent. This wasn't a crime of passion or a momentary lapse in judgment. This was calculated, methodical murder. The detective's voice was grim as she explained that the district attorney was now pursuing felony animal cruelty charges for each death, plus stalking, harassment, and attempted murder for the incident with Max. If convicted on all counts, Jake was looking at serious prison time. My phone exploded with messages from people I hadn't heard from in years, old friends apologizing for not believing me when I'd tried to explain what was happening. Former coworkers admitting they'd thought I was paranoid. Even my mother called, crying, saying she was sorry for dismissing my concerns and suggesting I was just unlucky. The validation felt hollow. I'd been screaming the truth for 18 months while everyone around me suggested I needed therapy or grief counseling or to just move on and stop dwelling on tragic coincidences. Where were all these supportive voices when I was being systematically gaslit by Jake and his enablers? Where was this belief when I was burying animal after animal while police refused to investigate? But I accepted their apologies anyway, because holding on to anger at them would only poison me the way Jake's hatred had poisoned him. Some battles weren't worth fighting when the real enemy was already facing justice. Max developed a routine over the following weeks. Every morning at 6, he'd do a complete perimeter check of the yard, nose to the ground, searching for any foreign objects or substances. His training never faltered. If he found anything suspicious, even a scrap of food blown in from a neighbor's trash, he'd alert immediately, sitting rigid and staring at it until I came to investigate. It became a game between us, me hiding training treats around the yard and him finding every single one within minutes. His intelligence was staggering, his dedication absolute. I'd never had a dog so in tune with my emotions and needs. When I had nightmares about finding another dead animal, I'd wake to find Max's head on my chest, his weight grounding me back to reality. He'd somehow known, through whatever mysterious connection exists between dogs and their humans, exactly when I needed him most. The trial date was set for 3 months out. Jake made bail, but with strict conditions, including a restraining order, keeping him at least 500 feet from me at all times, and electronic monitoring to track his movements. I installed more cameras, upgraded my security system, and Max and I started sleeping with my bedroom door locked and a chair wedged under the handle. The rational part of my brain knew Jake wouldn't risk violating the restraining order, not with his trial looming and his lawyer probably screaming at him to stay invisible. But the traumatized part, the part that had buried 9 animals and been called crazy for suspecting foul play, couldn't trust that he wouldn't try something desperate. Every car that drove past my house too slowly made my heart race. Every unexpected noise in the night sent Max to alert mode, both of us tense and waiting for danger that thankfully never came. Living in that constant state of hypervigilance was exhausting, but it was also necessary. Jake had spent 18 months proving he was capable of anything when his ego was bruised. The trial began on a Tuesday morning in late September with jury selection that took 3 full days. Jake's lawyer fought to exclude anyone who owned pets, claiming they'd be biased. The prosecutor fought to exclude anyone who'd ever been accused of animal cruelty or had restraining orders filed against them. Judge Henderson ended up with a jury of 12 people who ranged from skeptical to openly sympathetic, depending on which side was presenting. I watched them carefully during opening statements, trying to gauge their reactions. When the prosecutor showed photos of Whiskers, Bella, and Charlie in their happier moments before death, at least 4 jurors looked away. When Jake's lawyer argued this was all circumstantial evidence and unfortunate timing, those same jurors looked directly at Jake with expressions that made his lawyer visibly uncomfortable. The prosecution's case lasted 2 weeks. They brought in every piece of evidence methodically, building the timeline like a prosecutor assembling a puzzle where each piece locked perfectly into place. Security footage showing Jake entering my yard multiple times when I wasn't home. GPS data proving he'd been tracking my location for over a year. Phone records demonstrating he'd been searching online for undetectable poisons and how to kill pets without getting caught. Text messages to his friend Marcus bragging about teaching me a lesson, about making me understand what happens to people who reject him. Each new revelation made Jake sink lower in his chair, while his lawyer scrambled to object to everything and succeeded at nothing. The other victims testified in person. The woman from the bar whose cat died described how Jake had followed her home after she'd refused his advances, how he'd seemed charming at first, but turned aggressive when she'd firmly rejected him. The coworker whose elderly dog was poisoned broke down on the stand describing how that dog had been her companion for 13 years, how losing him so suddenly had devastated her. Jake's previous ex-girlfriend testified about the 3 rabbits she'd lost, about how Jake had sent her messages afterward asking if she'd learned her lesson about disrespecting him. The pattern was undeniable, brutal, systematic. Jake didn't just hurt these animals, he weaponized their deaths to torture the humans who dared to challenge his ego. Monica's testimony was particularly powerful. She described in detail how Jake had pursued her deliberately after learning she was my best friend, how he'd manufactured situations for them to be alone together, how he'd convinced her that I didn't really care about our friendship and wouldn't be hurt by their relationship. She admitted her own culpability with tears streaming down her face, but then revealed something I hadn't known. Jake had filmed them together that day I'd caught them, had set up his phone to record the whole encounter, and had been planning to show me the video himself if I hadn't come home early. He'd wanted me to see every detail, wanted to maximize my humiliation and pain. When Monica had discovered this weeks later and confronted him, he'd laughed and said, I deserved worse. 2 days after that confrontation, her puppy was dead. The jury looked physically ill, and Jake's lawyer spent his cross-examination trying desperately to discredit her testimony and failing spectacularly. The defense's case was pathetic. Jake's lawyer tried arguing that the security footage was doctored, but the prosecution's digital forensics expert destroyed that theory in under 10 minutes. He claimed the GPS device had been planted in my car by someone else trying to frame Jake, which made several jurors actually roll their eyes. He brought in character witnesses who testified that Jake was a good guy who volunteered at local charities and coached youth soccer, but the prosecution's cross-examination revealed that Jake had been banned from 2 of those charities for inappropriate behavior and fired from the soccer coaching position after parents complained about his aggression toward children who didn't follow his instructions perfectly. By the end of the defense's presentation, Jake's lawyer looked defeated, and Jake looked like he wanted to sink through the floor and disappear. Then came the moment I'd been waiting for. The prosecution called me back to the stand, but this time with Max. We'd spent weeks preparing for this, working with a professional canine handler to demonstrate Max's training and abilities. The judge had approved the demonstration over the defense's strenuous objections, ruling that Max's detection skills were relevant to understanding how I'd finally caught Jake in the act. The bailiff set up a row of 5 identical sealed containers on a table. 4 contained various harmless substances. The 5th contained a trace amount of the same rodenticide found in Jake's possession, sealed in a triple-layer protective container, so there was no possible contamination risk. Max and I entered the courtroom to absolute silence. I walked Max past each container slowly, watching his behavior. He sniffed the first 4 with mild interest, then moved on. When he reached the 5th, he stopped dead, sat rigidly, and stared at it with unwavering focus. That was his alert signal, the one that had saved his life and exposed Jake's attempted poisoning. The courtroom remained silent as I confirmed his alert. Then the prosecutor asked me to explain Max's training history and how police canines are used in criminal investigations. I described his 8 years of service, his perfect track record for detection work, his retirement only because his handler had died and the department had no budget for retraining him with someone new. When I finished, the prosecutor asked Jake's lawyer if he'd like to cross-examine. He declined. What could he possibly say? That a police-trained detection dog with years of proven success was wrong? That Max was somehow in on the conspiracy to frame poor innocent Jake? The prosecution rested with a final piece of evidence that made several jurors gasp audibly. Jake's social media posts from 18 months ago, just after our breakup, including one that said, "Some people don't know when they're lucky. Guess she'll learn the hard way what happens when you throw away something valuable." Another post from a month later. "Watching karma work is satisfying. Actions have consequences." And a third from right before Whiskers died. Some lessons are best learned through loss. The prosecutor walked the jury through each post alongside the timeline of animal deaths, showing how Jake had essentially been documenting his revenge campaign in real time, so confident that no one would ever connect the dots or believe he was capable of such cruelty. His arrogance had been his downfall, his need to feel clever and powerful overriding any instinct for self-preservation. Closing arguments took an entire day. The prosecution painted Jake as a narcissistic predator who couldn't handle rejection, and took out his rage on innocent animals because they were easy targets who couldn't fight back or tell anyone what he'd done. They presented a psychological profile from an expert who testified about the correlation between animal abuse and escalating violence toward humans, suggesting that if Jake hadn't been stopped now, it was only a matter of time before he moved on to hurting people directly. The defense's closing argument was weak and desperate, focusing on reasonable doubt and the possibility that all this evidence was somehow coincidental. By the time both sides rested, the jury looked ready to deliberate immediately rather than wait for the judge's instructions. Judge Henderson's instructions to the jury were clear and precise. They needed to consider each charge separately, needed to weigh the evidence objectively, needed to determine beyond reasonable doubt whether Jake had committed these crimes. She emphasized that emotional reactions weren't sufficient for conviction, that they needed to be convinced by the facts presented. The jury filed out at 3 p.m. I went home with Max, unable to eat, unable to focus on anything except my phone, waiting for the call that they'd reached a verdict. Every hour that passed felt like days. Detective Morrison texted me updates, saying long deliberations weren't necessarily bad, that thorough juries often took time to review evidence carefully. The call came at 9 the next morning. The jury had reached a verdict on all counts. I drove to the courthouse with Max, my hands shaking so badly I almost ran a red light. The courtroom was packed with reporters, other victims, random observers who'd followed the trial. Jake sat at the defense table looking smaller somehow, diminished, his expensive suit unable to hide the defeat in his posture. His parents were there too, his mother crying quietly, while his father stared straight ahead with no expression at all. I almost felt sorry for them, having to watch their son revealed as a monster. But then I remembered Whiskers and Bella and Charlie and all the others, and any sympathy evaporated. Their son had done this. Their son had chosen this path. Whatever pain they felt now was nothing compared to what he'd inflicted on his victims. The jury foreman stood, an older woman with gray hair and steady hands holding the verdict forms. Judge Henderson asked if they'd reached a unanimous verdict on all counts. The foreman said yes. The judge asked her to read the verdicts. On the charge of felony animal cruelty in the death of Whiskers, the jury found the defendant guilty. On the charge of felony animal cruelty in the death of Bella, guilty. Charlie, guilty. Every single count, every single animal, guilty, guilty, guilty. 9 counts of felony animal cruelty. 1 count of stalking, 1 count of harassment, 1 count of attempted animal cruelty for the incident with Max. Jake's mother sobbed openly. His father didn't move. Jake himself just stared at the table in front of him like if he looked at it hard enough, he could make this all disappear. But it wouldn't disappear. It was real. Finally. Terrifyingly, satisfyingly real. Judge Henderson set sentencing for 3 weeks out, remanding Jake to custody immediately. As the bailiffs led him away in handcuffs, he finally looked at me. Not with anger or hatred this time, but with something worse. Incomprehension. He genuinely couldn't understand how this had happened to him, how his perfect revenge plan had blown up so spectacularly, how the girlfriend he'd been so sure he'd destroyed had somehow gathered enough evidence to put him in prison. He'd underestimated me from the very beginning, dismissed me as someone too emotional and trusting to ever figure out what he was doing. That arrogance, that absolute certainty that he was smarter than everyone around him, had been his fatal flaw. Max pressed against my leg as Jake disappeared through the courtroom doors, and I finally let myself breathe. It was over. Really, truly over. Sentencing day arrived with an early autumn chill that made me grateful for Max's warm presence beside me as we climbed the courthouse steps. The gallery was even more packed than verdict day, with news cameras lining the hallway and reporters shouting questions I ignored. Jake's lawyer had filed multiple motions for reduced sentencing, arguing that his client had no prior criminal record and that animal cruelty cases rarely resulted in maximum penalties. The prosecution had filed their own motions, arguing for consecutive rather than concurrent sentencing, emphasizing the deliberate, premeditated nature of Jake's crimes and the number of victims across multiple jurisdictions. Judge Henderson would have the final say, and her reputation suggested she wasn't inclined toward leniency when the evidence was this overwhelming. The prosecution began with victim impact statements. I went first, walking to the podium with Max at my side. I'd written and rewritten my statement a dozen times, trying to capture not just my grief but the systematic nature of Jake's cruelty. I talked about Whiskers' trust issues that had taken weeks to overcome, how he'd finally started sleeping on my bed the night before he died. About Bella's joy when she discovered squeaky toys, how she'd made me laugh for the first time after the breakup. About Charlie's progress from terrified to confident, how proud I'd been watching him blossom. Then I talked about the aftermath of each death, the guilt of wondering if I'd somehow failed them, the paranoia of suspecting Jake but having no proof, the isolation of being called crazy by friends and family who thought I was projecting my breakup anger onto tragic coincidences. Jake had murdered these animals, but he'd also tortured me psychologically for 18 months, making me doubt my own sanity while he systematically destroyed the things I loved. When I finished, Jake's head was down, and several jurors from the trial who'd returned to watch sentencing were crying openly. The other victims spoke next, each adding their voice to the chorus of pain Jake had caused. The woman from the bar talked about the therapy she'd needed after her cat's death, how she'd developed anxiety around dating because she couldn't trust that rejection wouldn't result in violence. The coworker described how losing her elderly dog had devastated her to the point where she'd had to take medical leave from work, how she still couldn't bring herself to adopt another pet because the fear of losing it was too overwhelming. Jake's previous ex-girlfriend revealed that after her rabbits died, she'd attempted suicide, spending 3 days in psychiatric care before finally stabilizing. She looked directly at Jake as she spoke, her voice shaking but steady, telling him that he'd nearly succeeded in destroying her completely, but she'd survived and rebuilt her life while he'd be spending his best years in prison. Jake's lawyer objected to this characterization, claiming it was inflammatory, but Judge Henderson overruled him with visible irritation. These were the consequences of his client's actions, she said. The court needed to hear them. Monica spoke last among the victims. Her statement focused less on her puppy's death and more on the manipulation and control Jake had exerted over her. She admitted her role in our relationship's destruction, apologizing to me directly in open court, but then pivoted to describing how Jake had deliberately orchestrated the entire affair specifically to hurt me. He'd researched her vulnerabilities, exploited her insecurities about her own relationship status, manufactured an emotional connection that evaporated the moment he'd achieved his goal of destroying our friendship. When her usefulness ended, and she tried to assert boundaries, he'd punished her the same way he punished everyone else. She ended by saying that Jake's cruelty wasn't limited to animals, that his abuse of these helpless creatures was simply the most visible manifestation of a much deeper pathology that endangered everyone around him. The defense's case for leniency was embarrassingly weak. Jake's mother testified about what a good son he'd been as a child, how he'd helped with chores and gotten good grades and never caused trouble. Jake's father talked about family values and second chances, and how prison would ruin his son's future career prospects. Several friends gave character testimony that the prosecution easily dismantled on cross-examination, revealing that most of them had only known Jake superficially and had no knowledge of his relationships or personal life. Jake's lawyer argued that his client had shown remorse, that he'd accepted responsibility for his actions, But the prosecution immediately countered by playing jailhouse phone recordings, where Jake had told his parents this was all a misunderstanding and the jury had been biased against him because he was male. Zero remorse. Zero accountability. Just continued manipulation and victimhood. Then Jake himself spoke, against his lawyer's obvious advice. He stood at the podium and delivered what might have been the most tone-deaf statement I've ever heard. He apologized for any pain his actions may have inadvertently caused, as if poisoning 9 animals was somehow accidental. He said he'd been going through a difficult time emotionally after our breakup and made poor choices that he now regretted. He claimed he'd been struggling with substance abuse issues that impaired his judgment, a complete fabrication that the prosecution immediately refuted, with evidence showing he'd passed multiple drug tests throughout the investigation. He ended by saying he hoped everyone could move forward from this tragic situation and that he was committed to becoming a better person. Not once did he actually admit what he'd done. Not once did he acknowledge the deliberate, calculated nature of his crimes. He couldn't even manage genuine remorse while facing prison time. His narcissism was so complete, so absolute, that he still believed he could charm and manipulate his way into a lighter sentence. Judge Henderson's expression throughout Jake's statement was absolutely glacial. When he finished and sat down looking pleased with himself, she thanked him for his remarks in a tone that could freeze fire. Then she began her own statement, and I realized immediately that Jake had just sealed his fate. She methodically destroyed every argument the defense had made, pointing out that Jake's lack of criminal record meant nothing when weighed against the premeditated, systematic nature of his crimes. She noted that animal cruelty was increasingly recognized as a serious criminal offense, with strong correlation to escalating violence. She emphasized that Jake's stalking behavior and GPS tracking demonstrated a danger to public safety that extended beyond the animal victims. Most damning, she said that Jake's complete failure to show genuine remorse or accept responsibility indicated he remained a threat to commit similar crimes in the future if given the opportunity. The sentencing came down like a hammer. Felony animal cruelty in the first degree for each of the 9 animal deaths. Maximum penalty of 5 years per count. Stalking, 3 years. Harassment, 2 years. Attempted animal cruelty for the incident with Max, 4 years. Judge Henderson ordered the sentences to run consecutively rather than concurrently, meaning Jake would serve each one after completing the previous one. She calculated the total as she spoke. 45 years for the animal cruelty charges, plus 3 for stalking, plus 2 for harassment, plus 4 for the attempted poisoning of Max. 54 years total. Jake was 31 years old. If he served his full sentence, he'd be 85 when released. His entire life, gone. His mother's sobs echoed through the courtroom. His father sat frozen in shock. Jake himself looked like he'd been struck by lightning, his mouth hanging open in disbelief. But Judge Henderson wasn't finished. She added that Jake would be required to register as an animal abuser in every jurisdiction he resided in upon release, restricting his housing options and employment opportunities significantly. She imposed a lifetime ban on owning, possessing, or living with any animals. She ordered him to pay restitution to all victims for veterinary bills, funeral costs, and therapy expenses. She mandated that he complete substance abuse treatment and psychological counseling while incarcerated, though she noted dryly that she doubted either would be effective given his demonstrated inability to accept responsibility for his actions. By the time she finished, Jake's future had been reduced to decades of prison, followed by a restricted, monitored existence where his crimes would follow him everywhere. Justice hadn't just been served, it had been delivered with compound interest. As the bailiffs led Jake away for the last time, he turned back and tried to catch my eye, his face desperate and pleading like somehow I could fix this for him. I stared back without expression, Max sitting calmly at my side, and watched as reality finally penetrated his narcissistic delusion. I wasn't going to save him. I wasn't going to forgive him. I wasn't going to feel sorry for him or advocate for his appeal or write letters on his behalf. He'd systematically murdered 9 innocent animals and psychologically tortured multiple people for the crime of rejecting him, and now he would spend the rest of his life paying for that choice. His eyes widened as he understood, really understood, that his charm and manipulation and fake remorse had failed completely. Then the door closed behind him and he was gone. The aftermath was surreal. Reporters mobbed me outside the courthouse asking how I felt about the sentence, whether I thought justice had been served, what message I hoped this case would send. I kept my statement brief. Jake's sentencing represented accountability for deliberate cruelty, and I hoped it would encourage other victims of animal abuse to come forward and report similar crimes. Detective Morrison stood beside me during the impromptu press conference, adding that this case demonstrated law enforcement's commitment to taking animal cruelty seriously, as both a crime in itself and a warning sign of potentially escalating violence. Several animal welfare organizations released statements praising the verdict and calling for stronger animal protection laws nationwide. Jake had wanted to teach me a lesson about consequences. Instead, he'd become a cautionary tale about what happens when narcissistic cruelty meets actual accountability. That evening, I sat on my back porch with Max and opened a bottle of wine I'd been saving for when this was finally over. The shelter had called earlier, asking if I'd be willing to foster again now that the case was resolved. Mrs. Patterson's voice had been careful, understanding if I needed more time, but hopeful that I'd consider returning to rescue work. I looked at Max, who'd been watching me with those intelligent dark eyes, and realized I already knew my answer. Jake had tried to destroy my love for helping animals, had weaponized my compassion against me, had murdered innocent creatures specifically to break my spirit. But he'd failed. I'd survived. The animals I'd lost would never be forgotten, but there were others waiting who needed someone to give them a second chance. Jake was in prison. I was free. And I'd be damned if I let his cruelty win by preventing me from doing the work I loved. 6 months after Jake's sentencing, I stood in my backyard watching Max play with 3 new foster dogs I'd taken in from the shelter. An elderly beagle named Honey, who'd been surrendered when her owner went into hospice care. A young pit bull mix called Bruno, who'd been found starved and chained in an abandoned lot. And a nervous shepherd mix named Luna, who'd been surrendered by a family that didn't want to deal with her anxiety issues. All 3 had been deemed difficult cases by the shelter, the kind that usually lingered in kennels for months, because potential adopters wanted easy, perfect pets. But I'd always specialized in the difficult ones, the damaged and scared and traumatized. They just needed someone patient enough to see past their fear to the loyal, loving companions underneath. Max had taken to his role as alpha foster dog with surprising enthusiasm. He'd approach each new arrival calmly, let them sniff him thoroughly, then essentially communicate through body language that this was a safe space, and I was a trustworthy human. His training and confidence seemed to transfer to the foster dogs, helping them adjust faster than they might have otherwise. Honey had bonded with him immediately, following him around like he was her personal security guard. Bruno had learned proper social behavior by watching Max interact with me, mimicking his calm responses instead of the aggressive defensiveness he'd shown initially. Luna had gradually relaxed enough to sleep near us, though she still startled at sudden noises and needed extensive reassurance. Progress, not perfection. The security cameras remained active, upgraded to include audio and night vision capabilities that could detect anyone approaching the property from any direction. My car got checked weekly by a mechanic I trusted for any suspicious devices. The restraining order against Jake would remain in effect even after his release decades from now, though Detective Morrison had assured me that his prison record would make parole extremely unlikely. I joined a support group for victims of stalking and harassment, connecting with others who understood the lasting effects of systematic psychological abuse. Therapy helped too, working through the complex mix of vindication, grief, anger, and determination to move forward without letting Jake's actions define my life permanently. Monica and I had rebuilt our friendship slowly, carefully, with clear boundaries and honest conversations about what had happened and how to prevent future betrayals. She'd done her own therapy, working through the manipulation she'd experienced and her role in hurting me. Our friendship would never be exactly what it was before. That kind of innocence can't be recovered, but it had evolved into something more resilient. She'd adopted a cat named Pepper from the shelter, a spicy calico who'd been returned twice for being too independent, and had become an advocate for senior pet adoption. Watching her heal and grow had been unexpectedly healing for me too, proof that people could change and make amends if they genuinely wanted to. The news coverage of Jake's case had sparked several policy changes. The local district attorney's office created a specialized unit for animal cruelty cases, recognizing them as serious crimes that warranted dedicated resources. 2 neighboring counties updated their laws to increase penalties for animal abuse and make it easier to obtain protective orders on behalf of pets. Several rescue organizations began offering free security cameras and GPS tracking devices to foster families who'd experienced harassment or threats. Jake's case had been horrible, but at least some good had come from exposing his crimes and the systemic failures that had allowed them to continue for so long. Jake's parents had sent me a letter through their lawyer 4 months after sentencing. A long, rambling apology acknowledging their son's crimes and the pain he'd caused, asking if there was any way they could make amends or contribute to animal welfare causes in memory of the pets he'd killed. I'd spent a week deciding how to respond before finally writing back, suggesting they donate to the shelter's medical fund for treating abused animals. They sent a check for $10,000. It wouldn't bring back Whiskers or Bella or Charlie or any of the others, but it would help save future animals who needed expensive medical care their owners couldn't afford. I never heard from them again after acknowledging their donation. Some relationships are better left closed. The other victims from Jake's crimes had formed an informal support network, staying in touch through group chats and occasional meetups. We'd bonded over shared trauma and shared justice, celebrating small victories like adopting new pets or going on dates without panic attacks or finally sleeping through the night without nightmares. Several had testified at parole hearings for other animal abusers, using their experience to advocate for stronger sentences and better protective measures. Jake's previous ex-girlfriend, who'd attempted suicide, had gone back to school for social work, planning to specialize in helping domestic violence survivors and their pets. Every one of us had taken the worst thing Jake did to us and transformed it into motivation to prevent similar abuse from happening to others. Max turned 9 in the spring, and I threw him a birthday party in the backyard with all his foster siblings and some dogs from the neighborhood. Completely ridiculous and absolutely necessary. He wore a ridiculous party hat that he tolerated with dignity while I took approximately 400 photos. Bruno had been adopted by a firefighter who specifically wanted a dog with Bruno's energy and loyalty. Honey had gone home with an elderly couple who'd recently lost their own beagle and were looking for a senior dog to spoil. Luna was still with me, making progress every day, but not quite ready for adoption yet. I suspected she might become a foster fail, the kind of special needs case who ended up staying permanently because the bond was too strong to break. I was okay with that. Work at the animal hospital had become even more fulfilling. My coworkers had supported me throughout Jake's trial, covering shifts when I needed to attend court dates and bringing coffee during particularly difficult days. My boss had given me a raise and expanded my role to include training other technicians in trauma-informed care for abused animals. I'd started teaching weekend workshops at the shelter about recognizing signs of poisoning and protecting pets from deliberate harm. Each workshop included information about Jake's case, using it as a cautionary tale about the importance of taking animal cruelty seriously and reporting suspicious behavior. If sharing my nightmare could prevent even one other person from experiencing what I went through, it was worth the discomfort of reliving those memories. My dating life was non-existent, and I was fine with that. Several well-meaning friends had tried setting me up, insisting I needed to move on and trust again, but I wasn't interested in rushing into another relationship. Between work, foster dogs, therapy, and rebuilding my life, I had plenty to focus on without adding romance to the mix. Maybe someday I'd be ready to date again. Maybe I wouldn't. Either way, I refused to let Jake's actions dictate my choices out of fear. If I stayed single, it would be because I was genuinely content with my life as it was, not because he'd broken my ability to trust. That distinction mattered. Last month, I received a letter from Jake's lawyer informing me that Jake wanted to apologize personally and asking if I'd be willing to accept a phone call or visit. I laughed out loud reading it. The absolute audacity of thinking I'd give him any opportunity to manipulate me further or feel better about himself through some performative apology. I wrote back through my own lawyer with a simple response. No contact. Ever. For any reason. Any further attempts to reach me would be reported as harassment and used as evidence against him in any future parole hearings. The lawyer's response was terse, acknowledging my wishes. I hoped Jake understood that his attempts at redemption or forgiveness-seeking were pointless. I didn't forgive him. I didn't think about him. I'd moved on to a life where he was irrelevant except as a cautionary tale about narcissistic cruelty meeting consequences. This morning, I woke to Max's customary head pressed against my chest, his way of saying it was time for breakfast and morning patrol. Luna was curled at my feet, finally comfortable enough to sleep on the bed. The new foster dog arriving this afternoon, a senior lab mix named Duke with arthritis and a heart condition, would need a quiet introduction and patience while he adjusted. The sun was coming through my bedroom window, lighting up the framed photos on my dresser. Whiskers, Bella, Charlie, and all the others I'd lost. I'd promised them justice and delivered it. Now I was keeping my other promise by continuing the work they'd inspired me to do. Jake had tried to destroy my love for rescue work, but instead he'd made me more determined, more careful, more committed to protecting vulnerable animals from people exactly like him. He'd wanted me to learn a lesson about consequences. Instead, he'd become the lesson, and every animal I saved from this point forward would be proof that his cruelty had failed completely. Max barked once, impatient for breakfast, and I smiled. Time to start another day, another chance to make a difference, another opportunity to prove that surviving trauma doesn't mean letting it define you forever. Jake was in prison where he belonged. I was here, surrounded by dogs who needed me, doing work that mattered, living a life he'd tried to destroy but couldn't. Sometimes justice isn't just about punishment. Sometimes it's about taking back your power and refusing to let the person who hurt you steal your future. Sometimes it's about turning your worst nightmare into your greatest strength. And sometimes, when you're very lucky, it's about an 85-pound retired police dog who saved your life by simply being exactly what you needed when you needed it most.